The words hung in the air, a toxic cloud that seemed to poison the very oxygen in the room. Claire had replayed the moment 100 times, each time the visceral shock feeling just as fresh, just as chilling. It had been a chance encounter, a moment of vulnerability as she was leaving the Newman Enterprises building, her mind still reeling from the complexities of her newfound connection to the powerful dynasty. Victoria Newman, her cousin, had been kind, offering a fragile thread of hope that perhaps, after a lifetime of loneliness and instability, she could finally weave herself into the fabric of a real family. But that fragile hope was shattered in an instant by the figure who stepped out of the shadows, a vision of sleek, polished fury. It was Chelsea, Holden's wife. Her expression, usually a mask of charming composure, was twisted into something raw and menacing. There was no preamble, no polite veneer to soften the blow. She had simply stepped into Claire's path, her eyes burning with an intensity that felt physically hot, and delivered the threat not with a scream, but with a low guttural whisper that was far more terrifying. "I'm going to destroy your pregnancy." The sentence was so succinct, so specific in its target, that it bypassed Claire's rational mind and struck directly at her most primal core. It wasn't a general threat against her person or her position. It was a surgical strike aimed at the most precious, most vulnerable possibility she had only just begun to allow herself to dream of. A child, a family, a legacy that was truly her own. In the immediate aftermath, a numbness had set in, a protective shell that allowed her to mechanically get into her car, drive home, and lock the door behind her. But once the silence of her apartment closed in, the numbness cracked and pure, unadulterated fear came flooding in. Her hands, almost of their own volition, drifted to her stomach, pressing against the flat plane of her abdomen as if to shield a life that was, for now, merely a concept, a hope. She wasn't pregnant. Not yet. But the threat was so precise, so horrifyingly forward-looking, that it felt like an invasion of her future self. It spoke of an intent that was not merely reactive but deeply premeditated. Chelsea wasn't threatening her for something she had done, but for something she might do, for a future she might have. The violation of that was profound. It was as if Chelsea had peered into her most private dreams and decided to systematically dismantle them before they could even take root. Every flicker of a daydream about a nursery, every fleeting thought of what it might be like to hold a baby with Jordan's features or, God forbid, the Newman blue eyes, was now tainted, shadowed by the specter of Chelsea's promise. The joy was being systematically poisoned before it could even bloom. The logic of the threat was its own special kind of madness, a twisted knot that Claire's mind kept trying and failing to untangle. Holden. It always came back to him. Her brief, intensely confusing, and ultimately disastrous obsession with the man was a chapter of her life she was desperately trying to close, a symptom of the manipulation she had endured under her Aunt Jordan's cruel tutelage. She had seen Holden as a lifeline, a father figure, a savior, all twisted into one. But that delusion had been shattered. She understood now, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating, that her feelings were born of instability and coercion. She had made her amends, or was trying to, and she had genuinely believed that part of her life was over. But Chelsea clearly did not see it that way. In Chelsea's eyes, Claire would always be the unstable young woman who had fixated on her husband, a permanent threat lurking on the periphery of their marriage. The mention of pregnancy, therefore, could only mean one thing in Chelsea's paranoid calculus, that Claire was planning to entrap Holden, to use a child as the ultimate weapon to wedge herself permanently into his life and, by extension, tear their marriage apart. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Claire wanted nothing more than to sever that tie, to build an identity separate from the Newman drama, and here was Chelsea, holding her to a past she was desperately trying to escape, and threatening a future she had only just begun to imagine for herself, a future that had nothing to do with Holden Abbott. This led her down a darker, more terrifying path of speculation. How exactly did Chelsea plan to carry out this sinister promise? The words "destroy your pregnancy" echoed with a chilling finality that suggested more than just intimidation. Was it a threat of physical harm? The thought made Claire's blood run cold. Would she be pushed down a flight of stairs? Would her food or drink be tampered with at some society event? The world of Genoa City was no stranger to such brutal tactics. Its history was littered with poisoned cocktails, staged accidents, and outright violence. Or was Chelsea's approach going to be more psychological, More insidious? Perhaps she would launch a campaign to have Claire declared mentally unfit, to have her committed, ensuring any child would be taken from her at birth. With Chelsea's connections and Claire's own well-documented history, it was a frighteningly plausible scenario. Maybe it would be a web of lies convincing everyone, including a potential father, that the child wasn't his, or that Claire was an unfit mother. The methods were endless, and each one Claire conjured in her mind felt more feasible than the last. The uncertainty was a torture in itself. She was being forced to fear a shadow, to brace for an attack against a life that did not yet exist, from an enemy who was both resourceful and ruthlessly determined. This constant, gnawing fear began to reshape her behavior, distorting her perception of the world around her. A simple trip to the grocery store became a nerve-wracking ordeal. Every person who glanced her way for a moment too long was a potential agent of Chelsea's. Was that man in the aisle just looking for cereal? Or was he watching her? The sound of a car slowing down as she walked on the sidewalk made her heart leap into her throat. She found herself double-checking the locks on her doors, peering through the peephole before answering, her appetite vanishing as the stress coiled tightly in her stomach. She had fought so hard for a sliver of peace, for a chance at normalcy, and now it was being stolen from her by a sentence, a handful of words spoken in a hushed, venomous tone. The nascent connection she was trying to build with Victoria, with Nick, felt suddenly fragile, as if Chelsea's threat had the power to toxify those relationships too. How could she ever explain this to them? Would they even believe her? Or would they see it as more evidence of the instability they were only just beginning to look past? She was isolated, trapped in a prison of her own fear, the walls constructed from the promise of a future tragedy. The emotional toll was a relentless, grinding pressure. It was a unique form of agony, grieving for a potentiality, mourning a dream that was under siege before it could even be fully formed. She would see a mother with a stroller in the park and feel not a flicker of happy anticipation, but a cold dread. The thought of a first kiss, of intimacy with a man she might one day love, was now shadowed by the terrifying question of whether that act of love would make her a target. Chelsea had successfully weaponized Claire's own biology, turning the most natural desire for family into a source of paralyzing anxiety. The threat was a seed of dread that had been planted deep within her, and she could feel it taking root, its poisonous tendrils wrapping around her heart and her hopes. Sleep became a fleeting visitor, replaced by long dark hours spent staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through horrific scenarios, each one feeling more real than the last. The vibrant, hopeful woman who had begun to tentatively emerge was receding, replaced by a skittish, haunted figure, jumping at shadows and seeing a threat in every reflection. Yet, beneath the paralyzing fear, another emotion was slowly beginning to simmer, a spark of defiant anger. It was a faint glow at first, easily extinguished by a fresh wave of terror, but it was persistent. This was her life, her future, her body. Who was Chelsea to dictate its course? Who gave her the right to issue a decree against a life that wasn't hers to control? The injustice of it all began to burn away some of the fog of fear. Claire was no stranger to fighting. Her entire life had been a battle for survival, first against Jordan's manipulation, and then for her own sanity and place in the world. This was simply a new front in that same war. She had been backed into a corner, and while the instinct to curl into a ball and weep was powerful, the older, more resilient instinct to fight back was starting to make its voice heard. She couldn't live like this, a ghost in her own life, perpetually waiting for the other shoe to drop. The threat had been made, and it was real, but allowing it to control her was a form of surrender she was no longer willing to contemplate. This internal shift from pure victimhood to a nascent sense of defiance marked a critical turning point. The fear did not vanish. It was a constant, cold companion, but it was now joined by a steely resolve. She began to think not just about how to hide, but about how to protect herself. She needed a plan. She needed evidence. A threat like this, spoken in private with no witnesses, was her word against Chelsea's, and in the court of Genoa City public opinion, Chelsea held most of the cards. But Claire wasn't entirely powerless anymore. She had resources, however new and tenuous. The first, most difficult step would be to confide in someone. Victoria, with her fierce protectiveness and immense power, was an obvious but risky choice. Would her loyalty to family extend to Claire, the troubled newcomer, over Chelsea, a known quantity? Or Nick, whose inherent decency and distance from the situation might lend him a more objective view. Perhaps even Kyle, who understood the complexities of the Abbott family dynamics better than anyone. Choosing the wrong confidant could backfire spectacularly, reinforcing Chelsea's narrative of Claire as a scheming liar. The path forward was shrouded in uncertainty, a treacherous landscape where every potential ally could also be a potential enemy. But the alternative, silent suffering, was no longer an option. Chelsea's threat had drawn a line in the sand, and Claire realized she had to choose which side of that line she would stand on. She could remain in the shadows, defined by fear, allowing Chelsea to dictate the terms of her existence and preemptively destroy her chance at happiness. Or she could step into the light, armed with the terrible knowledge of what she was up against, and fight for the future she deserved. The words, "I'm going to destroy your pregnancy," would forever be etched into her memory, a scar on her psyche. But a scar, while a permanent reminder of a wound, is also a sign of healing, of survival. The battle for Claire's future, for the right to a family and a life free from this looming shadow, had just begun. And in the quiet of her apartment, with the fear still a palpable presence, a new feeling was taking hold, the grim, determined understanding that she would do whatever it took to protect the dream she had only just allowed herself to dream. The war was undeclared, the enemy was powerful and motivated, and the most precious thing of all was what was at stake. She would not go down without a fight. Claire had been trying for weeks to establish a sense of normalcy in Genoa City, but nothing about her new life was simple. She was still adjusting to what it meant to be part of the Newman family, still figuring out her place with Victoria, and still learning how to coexist with the past that haunted her. But nothing had prepared her for the storm that arrived the moment Holden's wife walked into the room, eyes sharp, tone cold, and every inch of her radiating possession and fury. Claire hadn't expected kindness, but she hadn't expected a threat delivered with such venom either. Holden's wife didn't bother with pleasantries. She stepped closer, her voice low enough that only Claire could hear it. The quietness made it worse. Rage always felt sharper when whispered. She said the words with a strange, chilling clarity, as if she had rehearsed them 100 times in her head. "I'm going to destroy your pregnancy." Claire felt the air leave her lungs. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard wrong. She wasn't even pregnant. The threat made no logical sense, yet the malice behind it was unmistakable. Maybe the woman didn't care about facts, only about hurting her, intimidating her, breaking her spirit before she could get grounded in this new chapter of her life. Fear began as a flicker but quickly tightened around her chest. Claire tried to keep her breathing steady, tried not to show her panic. It wasn't just the words, it was the hatred in the woman's face. Someone with that much anger didn't need reality to justify their actions. Claire knew that all too well from her past. People driven by obsession didn't need truth. They created their own narratives and lived inside them. Holden's wife was clearly spiraling, desperate to reclaim something she believed belonged to her, even if it meant lashing out at an innocent target. Holden appeared moments later, as if drawn by the rising tension. The way his wife's eyes snapped toward him carried a mix of wild fear and indignation. He tried to calm her, tried to explain that there was nothing romantic between him and Claire, that the connection he felt was only familial concern or emotional empathy. But his wife wasn't listening. Her jealousy twisted everything she saw. And to her, Claire, young, fragile in appearance, trying to rebuild her life, looked like a threat. Holden reached for his wife's arm, but she jerked away, glaring at Claire like she was witnessing some betrayal that hadn't happened. Claire stepped back instinctively. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, her hands trembling despite her effort to hide it. She had survived manipulation, cruelty, and gaslighting from Aunt Jordan. She had survived being used, brainwashed, and turned into a weapon. But this was a new layer of fear because it came so unexpectedly and held a different kind of unpredictability. Holden's wife wasn't calculating. She was emotional. And emotional people could be dangerously impulsive. Claire knew she was dealing with someone who could switch from verbal threats to physical aggression without warning. Victoria entered the hall right as Holden's wife hurled another accusation. Victoria instantly sensed something was wrong. A mother's intuition, sharp and protective. She saw Claire's paling face, the tension in Holden's posture, and the fury radiating from his wife. Victoria stepped closer, positioning herself subtly in front of Claire. An unconscious but unmistakable act of defense. She demanded an explanation, her tone steady but edged. Holden's wife tried to twist the story, insisting Claire had been manipulating her husband, that she had seen the signs, that Claire was trying to trap Holden with a pregnancy that didn't even exist. It would have sounded absurd if her emotional spiral hadn't been so intense. Victoria's expression shifted from concern to outrage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The sternness in her tone carried the weight of a mother who had fought too hard and too long for her daughter to allow someone to threaten her again. She told Holden's wife that her behavior was unacceptable, that she needed to step away and reevaluate her accusations. But the woman only grew more volatile, insisting she was protecting her family. The irony was painful. Claire had never had a real family until now, and yet she was the one being treated like an intruder. Holden, exhausted by the confrontation, finally managed to pull his wife aside, speaking to her firmly but gently. Claire couldn't hear what he said, but she could see the strain in his face. He was torn, caught between his wife's insecurities and his desire to ensure Claire felt safe. Claire hated being the cause of conflict, especially for someone who had shown her nothing but kindness. She tried to speak to assure his wife that there was nothing going on, no hidden intentions, no secret feelings. But the woman wasn't listening. Her mind was already locked onto a narrative fueled by jealousy, fear, and misunderstanding. Later, after the confrontation had ended and Holden managed to get his wife out of the house, Claire found herself sitting in the quiet of the Newman living room, holding a throw pillow like an anchor. She tried to steady herself. Victoria sat beside her, placing a hand gently on her back. The moment felt fragile, tender in a way that made Claire feel both comforted and painfully vulnerable. She admitted that the threat had scared her in a way she hadn't expected. The words echoed in her mind, violent, irrational, terrifying. Even though she wasn't pregnant, the cruelty behind the threat cut deep. Victoria reminded her that she was safe, that the Newmans would protect her, that impulsive jealousy wasn't going to dictate her future. Claire nodded, but her hands still shook. She knew fear didn't disappear just because someone told you were safe. It lingered, it clung. It whispered reminders of trauma. And this threat had stirred all the buried fears she had tried to keep under control since escaping Jordan's manipulation. The idea that someone could hate her instantly without justification, simply because of a misunderstanding. It brought back the helplessness she had felt most of her life. As the day wore on, Claire couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. She worried Holden's wife might return. She worried the threats might escalate. But she also feared for Holden. He was in a marriage unraveling under suspicion and emotional instability. Claire never wanted to be the reason anyone's relationship cracked apart. She knew too well what it meant when family structures broke. She had lived through the debris of shattered trust. She didn't want to be a catalyst for more pain. Holden returned later that evening, visibly stressed. He apologized to Claire, though none of it had been her fault. He explained that his wife had been struggling long before Claire entered the picture, that insecurities and unresolved resentments had been building for years. Claire didn't know what to say. She wished she could help, but she didn't know how. She felt like a disruption in a life she had only brushed against. Holden told her he wouldn't allow anything to happen to her, that he would never let anyone threaten her again. His voice was sincere, but she saw the desperation beneath it. He was trying to protect both women in his life, and he didn't know how to keep the balance. When night finally came, Claire lay awake in her room, replaying everything. The words still hurt. The hostility felt personal even though they came from a stranger's insecurity. Claire wondered if this was simply the price of trying to rebuild a life. Unexpected blows, painful moments, and the constant need to find emotional footing after being knocked down. But she also realized something else. She wasn't alone anymore. Victoria had stood up for her. Holden had defended her. She had people willing to fight for her, and that was a new kind of strength she had to learn to lean on. Still, fear has a way of whispering even in the presence of safety. Claire found herself imagining worst-case scenarios, wondering if Holden's wife might return, whether the threat might morph into something even more dangerous. The idea of being dragged into someone else's broken marriage terrified her. She didn't want to become a symbol of someone's insecurity, didn't want her presence to be weaponized against a woman already drowning in distrust. Yet she couldn't control how others perceived her. Over the next few days, the tension lingered. Claire avoided situations where Holden and his wife might appear again. She tried to keep herself busy, helping Victoria, spending quiet moments with family, reminding herself of how far she'd come. But the emotional residue of the confrontation clung to her like a shadow. She could still hear the whisper, could still feel the chill of the threat. Sometimes she wondered if healing was always going to feel this fragile. Like one unexpected blow could send her spiraling back into fear. Victoria suggested they talk to Nick or even to Victor about security concerns just in case. Claire protested at first, not wanting to cause trouble. But Victoria insisted, no threat, real or not, would be dismissed where her daughter was concerned. Claire felt a mix of guilt and gratitude. She wasn't used to someone taking her safety so seriously. It made her emotional in ways she didn't expect. Meanwhile, Holden's wife had become increasingly unpredictable, according to Holden's quiet updates. She was convinced Claire had some hidden agenda. Holden said he was trying to get her to accept counseling, but she resisted, clinging to her suspicion like a shield. Claire felt awful knowing she was at the center of a conflict she never asked for. She wished the woman could see that she wasn't competition, wasn't an enemy, wasn't trying to come between anyone's marriage. She just wanted a peaceful life free from fear. The more days passed, the more aware Claire became of the thin line between perceived threats and actual danger. She couldn't assume Holden's wife would let the matter go. People fueled by jealousy rarely did. And soap opera life in Genoa City had taught her that threats sometimes grew into complicated schemes or unpredictable confrontations. Claire began taking extra precautions, staying close to family members when outside the house, making sure she wasn't alone in vulnerable areas. She hated feeling paranoid, but she also knew ignoring the situation would be irresponsible.